Miss Anthony, my name is Cheryl, and I'm from Spencerport, New York.
Oh, wonderful. A near neighbor.
I was curious why you were not in attendance at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848.
I was not in attendance at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 because I was a school teacher in New Rochelle at the time. I was doing everything I could to raise money for my family. They had suffered a serious financial reverse in the Panic of 1837, and that is indeed what prompted them to move from Battenville, New York, to west on the Erie Canal to Rochester, where they had family who was going to be able to help them get a farm. There was a similar convention held the next day in Rochester that my mother and my sisters attended, and they told me about all of the proceedings. And I had heard about it, and I had read about it. And when I finally had the pleasure and privilege of meeting Mrs. Stanton in 1851 in Seneca Falls, then lightning struck, and we began what has now been a lifelong association.
Aunt Susan, we have a question on your right.
Hello, I'm Cindy Lee from Anderson, South Carolina. And were you the only one arrested from the women that voted that day? You said several of your friends also voted.
Yes, there were warrants put out for most of the others, and things did tend to reach a stalemate. Some of them paid just fines quietly so it would go away. Our former neighbor, Rhoda DeGorma, died before her case was able to come up. But I think I was the one that they were most eager to make an example of, so some of the others could just quietly fade away.
And so to keep the camera knowing where the question is coming from, we're going to go, we went center right, and then we need a question from the left. That's our turn.
We have one
this
over
side.
here, yes?
There is one right over here, and then we'll go to the center, and then we go to the right. So be prepared.
My name is Terry Daly, and I'm from Fairport, New York.
Oh.
Just down the road a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Two questions, if I could. One is, what kind of reputation do you have in Rochester right now? Are you well received?
Well, in Rochester, I'm well known. If you're from Fairport, then you know that Rochester has a great history of progressive and egalitarian views. When I first moved to Rochester, we were very active in the abolitionist movement. William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Frederick Douglass were all guests at my father's farm, and there were stops on the Underground Railroad in Rochester. So in Rochester, I don't want to open my plumage, but I think that I was pretty well known in Rochester and generally well received. So that was one question. Was there another?
Well, actually, you answered the second, because I was going to ask you if you happened to cross paths with Frederick Douglass.
Yes, indeed. We were very close friends. He eulogized at my father's funeral, as I did at his. We lost him just recently. He had moved to Washington, D.C. by then, but he was he came back to Rochester to be buried at the Mount Hope Cemetery, where my family plot is and where there is a space waiting for me when it's my time. We did have a little bit of disagreement over the 14th and 15th Amendment. We objected, and there was a little clause that I didn't get back to in the 14th Amendment. It says that apportionment, in the second section, apportionment of representatives will be determined by the enumeration of every whole individual in the state. Now, why did they have to say whole individual? Once a school teacher, always a school teacher. Slaves were not considered whole people. You might remember that when the Constitution was first being written, the southern states wanted to count the slaves and therefore increase the size of their representation in the House of Representatives. But of course the slaves couldn't vote and they weren't treated as people at all. And the northern states said nothing doing. And they came up with the 3/5 compromise, where each slave was counted as 3/5 of a person for representational enumeration. So now in Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, it says everyone has to count as a whole person, and this is what caused me no end of trouble and continues to cause me trouble to this day. It says if any male citizens are denied the right to vote, then the representation will be diminished according to that proportion. It did specify male. I was afraid that people were going to interpret that to mean that only men could vote to begin with, although by standards of logic it was not necessarily so. And I opposed the 14th Amendment. Many of the people in my movement opposed the 14th Amendment because we wanted them to strike that word male. And after all the work we had done as abolitionists, after all of our standard bearing for equal rights for all, Mr. Douglas said, we cannot wait. We must pass this now. Now is the Negro's hour. We cannot wait. And I was confident that if the women got the vote first, that they would bring their black brothers and sisters into the franchise with them. I was less confident, and apparently with good reason, that the men would bring their white and black sisters and mothers into the franchise with them.
Here in the center aisle, we have a question about the voting rights.
Larry Allen from Easley. How come Wyoming beat the nation in giving women rights to vote? Did y'all's movement have anything to do with that?
We certainly visited the territories, and as they were being admitted to statehood, we certainly hoped that they would have the franchise for the women. And I don't know, what can I say? The women are tough out there in Wyoming, and I don't think the men would have dared try to stop them. I did go visit them, and they came in with universal suffrage in their constitution. When Colorado got female suffrage, that was done by popular vote. That was the first one that was done. And again, who could vote? Only the men. But men know that it is in the interest of the nation. I should say men of thoughtful quality know that it is in the interest of the nation to keep everyone fully engaged in the process. And they understand they have nothing to lose. No one wants to take the rights away from them. We used to have a newspaper called The Revolution, and under the masthead it said, men, their rights and nothing more, women, their rights and nothing less.
We have a question on your right. Good evening. My name is Kathy. I'm from Seneca, South Carolina. And thank you for the lovely way that you dressed for us tonight on this warm evening.
Oh, well, you know, people, when we have a great rally and a great crowd, sometimes it is hard to find me. And so I have gotten into the habit of wearing all black, which just makes it, some people think I do this because of my Quaker origins. And when I was young, I did need to dress in very dark, plain clothing. But when I went out on my own, I had colorful clothing. I could wear whatever I wanted. But if you want to make a point, if you want to be seen, this was very helpful. I did try for a while wearing bloomers. It was Amelia Bloomer who introduced me to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And they did seem very practical. And Mrs. Stanton loved them. And, of course, Mrs. Bloomer loved them. But I found that I was just too tired of being laughed at, and if people were laughing at what I was wearing, then they weren't listening to what I was saying. So I was fairly content to go back to more traditional dress.
Well, you are awfully lovely this evening.
Oh, well, thank you so much, as are you.
Why, thank you. Here's my question.
Oh.
My question is about social networking. You have talked a lot about how you would rally people around. I wonder what your takeaway message would be for us to give us advice based on your experience about how to rally people around what is wise and rational and good.
Oh, well, I'm glad that you think that. And I did learn a lot of my organizing skills during my time in the Temperance Union and the time in the abolitionist movement. You need to have chapters, small town chapters, where people can keep in touch with each other very much. The mail comes several times a day, so you can, of course, be reaching people by mail. Newspapers are wonderful ways to make announcements. There are several newspapers in most major cities, and you can make an announcement of a rally or a meeting that's going to be held in such and such a place and such a date. And of course, people can just take placards and post them in public places and just talking to one another as they go about their day. And it seems to work pretty well for us.
Our next question is on your left, and it's in the back. Can you stand and tell us your name and where you're from?
I'm Loy Rose from Gray Court. Ms. Anthony, thanks so much for visiting us here in Greenville.
It's been my pleasure.
And certainly just listening to you has given us more strength as women to stand up
I'm happy
and
to
be
hear
heard.
that.
I'm sorry to hear of the death of your father.
Oh, well, he died some years ago.
Yes.
Yes.
But actually, the question I have relates to that. Because women were unable to own property, was he able to will to his daughters any of the property that he left behind?
Yes, well, we had to do a little bit of creative bookkeeping, I think, in order to make that possible. When he passed away, which was in 1866, my mother was able, as a married woman, she was able to. She was then a single woman and was therefore able to inherit the farm, and even getting the farm was supposed to be left to my mother by a relative, but at that time she was a married woman, so she could not inherit it, and otherwise. My father would have been happy to take his legal right at that time and have the farm be his, but he was in bankruptcy proceedings at the time. So we did not want them to be able to attach the farm to the bankruptcy, so it went to a male cousin until all of that was taken care of and then was given back to my family. So my mother was able to buy a house in town next door to where my sister Hannah was living, and she and my sister Mary went and lived there, and that became my base when I wasn't out on the road. Did I answer your question? Okay, very good. Yes.
Well, wait. Can we, if we need to speak in the mic so everybody can hear?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Thanks so much for answering the question. I also know you never got married.
That's true.
Can you tell us a little about that?
Yes, I can tell you a little bit about that. I had suitors. I had male companions I was fond of, but I was not interested in losing my legal selfhood in order to achieve a state of marriage. And I looked around me at what marriage was in all but the rarest cases. In all but the rarest cases, if a woman married poor, she became a housekeeper and a drudge. If she married rich, she became a doll. And I thought, gracious, had I accepted any of those offers of marriage when I was a girl, I would have been a drudge or a doll for 50 years. I was very happy to have the freedom to throw myself into this movement. Someone needed to be available. I worked with Mrs. Stanton, who was married and had 7 children and could not get out onto the road as much as I could. So I would go and visit her in Seneca Falls, and her son observed that Susan stirs the pudding while mother stirs up Susan, and Susan goes out and stirs up the world. And that is one of the ways that we worked very well as a team. I was so nervous about public speaking at first. She was much the better and more confident speaker than I was. But when she just kept having children, she just couldn't go out on the road anymore. And she would write things for me at first that would make me feel more confident. But over time, I have found my own voice.
We have a question over here on your
The
left.
question is from the center is coming next.
I have one up.
No, actually, we're over to the left.
Over to the left.
The other left.
Other left.
Oh, never mind. I'm stealing it back. Here I come. I'm getting it.
Doesn't think I have a right to vote over here. Right here? Okay. Rhonda from Greenville. As a daughter of a strong mother, and as 2 daughters here, I'd like to know what influences your mother had on your life.
Oh, thank you for that question. My mother was warm, gracious, very hardworking. One influence that she had on me may have been my disinclination to marry and have children. When I saw how much work there was when she was in bed near the birth of my younger brother, my sister Goldman and I took over the work of the household, and at that time we were also feeding some of the mill workers, and we would have to bake, for example, 20 loaves of bread a day just in order to satisfy that. She was a wonderful supporter of my work. She was not a forward woman. She was not a robust woman, but in her heart, she was there. She wanted to support us. I will tell you one funny thing about my mother, though, that actually is quite shrewd. In her will, my sister Mary and I were living in the house at that time. She left the house to marry rather than to me, even though I'm the older sibling and you would think I should be the one who got it, but she was quite sure, and I think she was right, that if she left the house to me, I would have sold it to raise money for the cause. So by leaving it to Mary, and I'm glad she had better judgment than that, I had a place to come home to and a place to feel safe and well cared for. So my mother's heart was always in the right place. I think she was worn out, so she didn't go out on the ramparts, so to speak, with me. But I knew I had her love and support, and that was very important.
To your right, Aunt Susan.
Yes.
I'm Stephen, and I am from the Low Country and a plantation owner in this great state. And I am well educated, and I have read the Constitution many times.
Oh, very good.
And I believe in the separation of powers. And the Supreme Court is the final judge on what the Constitution says. And as long as the Supreme Court says that there will not be a woman's right to vote, because it is a state's right to determine who votes, I believe that that's the case. Tonight you have presented a great argument to the women in the audience. But if you are to get the right to vote in South Carolina, you'll have to convince me of what that is, because then I can give you the right to vote. How will you do that?
Yes, well, fortunately, you don't have to win all the votes in order to win the contest. I take your point, sir, and that is why the founders in their great wisdom made it possible for us to amend the Constitution if we find that it is not serviceable to our needs. As brilliant as they were, they knew they could not possibly anticipate all situations for all time. And yes, if the Supreme Court decided, I think it was an erroneous decision, because I think that we did have the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state. That was already in the Constitution before it was given to the Supreme Court to decide. So I think it was an erroneous decision. And in order to convince you, I would appeal to I find the people who are most against this are the ones who put the women highest on a pedestal. You know, my mother was the most sainted, patient, loving, kind woman in the world. My wife is the most loyal, bakes the best apple pie, is so wonderful and patient with the children, and has nothing but praise for them. But if you deny them the vote, you are insulting their judgment, you are insulting their abilities, you are insulting their intelligence. And that is what Mr. Train, who actually financed the newspaper, The Revolution, that when the suffrage vote lost in Kansas, he said, "You have all insulted your wives and your mothers, and gentlemen hate to insult their mothers." So that might be one way I could appeal to you. The other way that I would appeal to you is, again, to point you to the wonderful principles that this nation was founded on and that we fought the British with. I'll tell you one more story about my sister Mary, and that is that as a property owner, she owed taxes. She had no say. She was not able to vote for the government that levied these taxes on her, but she was a law-abiding citizen, so she would write out her check, and she would write, "Paid under protest. Taxation without representation is still tyranny."